Milk? No servants? Colin? Sometimes you just have to call the historical accuracy police. Hi, I'm Tim and I have too many books. I'm going to talk about the Bridgerton series written by Julia Quinn. I'll talk about the books and in a later video I'll talk about the television series that comes after it. Now the Bridgerton series is 8 books following the 8 Bridgerton children as they grow up and marry. They are alphabetically named, which is a quite cute idea, although it doesn't always work. These books are set in Regency, England, starting in about 1813. The books are well written, you are interested in the characters, you like the characters, you want to know their stories, and they are overall very entertaining. I've read 3 of the books and I'm about to read the 4th. One of the things to say about these books is that although Julia Quinn mostly gets things right, occasionally she doesn't, and this tends to take me out of the story. It's probably worth talking a little bit about historical accuracy. Julia Quinn has said that her works are romantic fantasy and the historical accuracy police shouldn't really get involved, and I can understand that. Historical accuracy is only important if it is important to you, really. Now, the problem for me is I know enough history to be dangerous. I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I do know quite a lot of history. And I do get taken out of the story if I feel that something doesn't quite work historically. Now, Julia Quinn occasionally gets things wrong. We'll come to some of the biggies in the rest of this video. But other Regency romance novelists, especially Americans, can really take me out of the story every 20 pages, especially one particular author who I won't name but has been recommended to me on a number of occasions by other booktubers. Yeah, it was every 20 pages. It's really not very good. If you keep doing that, it really ruins the story for you because I can't keep concentrating. You may be able to because maybe you're not taken out of the story, and if you're not taken out of the story, that's great. It's a problem for me and not a general problem. You don't have to get history right, but you have to keep people in the story. And if you don't get history right for me, I'm not going to stay in the story, and at some point I might just give up on the book entirely. This is not the case with Julia Quinn. Like I said, most of the time she gets things right. But it is worth talking about historical accuracy generally. Now, I would say that there are 4 different kinds of historical accuracy. There is the probable, the possible, the impossible, and the Now, the probable is our generally accepted idea of what a particular time period was like. This will depend on the time we live in and the culture we live in. If you're writing about another culture, you may well get things wrong because you don't properly understand the culture you're writing in, and there's always a danger of that. But the probable is what is generally accepted, and it's really what your audience will accept. They're not going to write into you saying, no, that wouldn't have happened, or try to correct you if you stick to what is the probable, the most likely thing to have happened. To make your story more interesting, of course, what you need to do is delve into the possible. These are things that were less likely to have happened and that your readership may not know about. And this means that you risk having to, on social media, just have to keep going, actually, this actually happened, which is not a particularly nice thing to have to do. Even worse, you might have to put in footnotes into your book which says the same. Now, a skillful writer will introduce the possible subtly. They will model their story on a real example of history and do it subtly, introducing it slowly so that people get used to it. So even if they are jarred by the thing that they don't think is particularly probable, they will accept it as possible because the writer has brought them along to that point. So, for example, if you wanted to have the actress marrying the Duke, you could take the example of Lavinia Powlett, who married the Duke of Bolton and became the Duchess of Bolton, or books, but also you can go to literature and look at contemporary examples of, say, a servant marrying her master. We can take the example of Samuel Richardson's Pamela, where this indeed happens. And actually, Pamela is quite a good example because there are several counter-Pamela novels published after Pamela which sort of lampoon it and say how inaccurate his characterisation of, say, Pamela or the relationship that she would have had with her master. The next kind of historical accuracy is the impossible. Now, this should seem rather odd that I'm talking about the impossible, but there's sort of two ways to be impossible and get it right. One is to use fantasy. A brilliant example of a fantasy book that is set in the Regency is, of course, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Susanna Clarke just creates this believable Regency and Napoleonic War world, and at the same time she just creates a brilliant fantasy world. There are other examples. Lex Croucher's book Reputation takes the Regency and makes people behave a little bit like modern high schoolers. That works okay. Quite a lot of people liked it. I wasn't too sure, but I don't mind if you swing and you miss. Another example would be The Emperor's Babe by Bernardine Evaristo, where she has a girl in Roman times speaking like a modern Black Londoner. And it kind of works. Again, I don't mind if you make a swing and a miss. I don't mind if you sort of try to create something that is unlikely and anachronistic, so long as you stick to your guns. And often the best way to create something like that is to get all your other history right. Susanna Clarke, like I said, creates a very believable Napoleonic and Regency Britain. There's also the fantasy elements, but woven into it is this sort of historical truth that she's also writing. And I think that's very important when we judge this thing. Now, we then move on to what I call the no sorry, and this is kind of the impossible stuff where, the writer hasn't done enough research. They've assumed things that are just ridiculous. An example of this is a recent book. I won't say what it was, but it was a fairly buzzy book on BookTube. And I read it and was taken out of the book when we have a character going into a drawing room and wondering why aristocrats had a room where you went to draw. Now, I'm not going to tell you what a drawing room is, you have to look it up, but it did strike me that here is a writer who assumed the meaning of the word, didn't bother to look it up themselves, and just to make a rather snide joke about aristocrats having a special room for drawing. Now, there's a couple of books which I've found very useful for reading up about these times. One is Ian Mortimer's Time Traveller's Guide to Regency Britain. This is one of Ian Mortimer's Time Traveller's Guides, where he takes you to a particular time and place. He's done Victorian, Elizabethan and Restoration Britain. And he basically takes you through a day looking at all the different classes of people and what they would get up to. Another book is Letters to Alice by Fay Weldon. Now, Fay Weldon adapted Pride and Prejudice in 1980, and I always want people to see that adaptation. Although the acting does seem rather stagey, I do actually think that the casting overall is better than any other production. Some years after adapting Pride and Prejudice, Fay Weldon came out with a book called Letters to Alice. And Letters to Alice is really a sort of pocket biography of Jane Austen's life, talking about her books and what society was like at the time. And really it's sort of a way of Fay Weldon using her research for her adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. And it's a fascinating book, and I keep coming back to it because I think it really adds to the knowledge of what Jane Austen's life and times were. And of course, if we're talking Jane Austen, we are talking the Regency, which is part of the reason why people write Regency romances, is because of Jane Austen. As I said, Julia Quinn usually gets her history right, especially if she's done the research, but occasionally she gets it wrong. Now, I'm going to talk about one particular thing that really took me out of the story and made me lose trust with her for a while. I just didn't trust her after reading this bit. It's what I call the milk scene. So I'll set the scene for you. Daphne Bridgerton, the heroine of the book The Duke and I, is unable to sleep. She's at the townhouse of the Bridgertons, and which is set in Eaton Square. She wants some more milk. She hopes that will help her get to sleep. So she heads downstairs, wondering if she's going to find any members of her family knocking around or any of the servants. She comes across her brother, Anthony, in his study. Anthony doesn't actually live in the Bridgerton's house. He has lodgings elsewhere. But he's here because he's got to do work on the accounts. His secretary has gone off to get married, so he's rather overworked. He also declares that he would rather like a cup of warm milk, so they decide to head to the kitchens to see what they can find. They find some milk in a bottle, but they can't get the range to work. It's a closed range, we're told, which is basically an enclosure around an open fire. Obviously, Julia Quinn did her research for the closed range bit. They can't get to the range to operate, so they decide to drink the milk as it is. It's definitely described as cold, and I believe it is described also as tasting fresh. We also see Anthony with a milk moustache, rather in the style of the Got Milk adverts that used to be very popular in America. I had all kinds of problems with this scene. Massive problems with this scene. You may not have done, and good. So I may be ruining this for you. I'm sorry about that, but it kind of bothered the heck out of me. It took me out of the story, and I went down a rabbit hole of research just to check whether or not I was right in being bothered by it. And overall I think I kind of was. Now, one of the sources for this was Mark Kalansky's book, Milk, which is a history of humans' interaction with, mostly with cow's milk. He writes very interesting books about sort of foodstuffs, does Mark Kalansky. Now, here's my problems with the milk scene. I'm not going to talk about the servants right now, although we'll be getting to them. However, I would mention that Anthony Bridgerton would not have a house key. And that door, and the front door, or all the doors of the house, all the exterior doors of the house would be locked, bolted. So he would have to ask a servant to unbolt those doors and bolt them after he'd left, if he was going to leave that night, and he was planning at some point to leave. So there would have had to be a servant in beck and call somewhere nearby, and they could have fixed all this for them. However, okay, we'll accept that they go into the kitchen and try to get some warm milk. Now, there's a big problem with going into the kitchen because it's a big taboo in a sort of an aristocratic household to go into the servants' areas. You're not supposed to. Julia Quinn knows this because later in the book it is mentioned by Daphne. She goes to visit the housekeeper in her parlour office and apologises to the housekeeper for going into the servants' area. They know that Anthony and Daphne would know that they should not be in the kitchen. They don't know anything about the kitchen. They've probably never been in the kitchen, or if they have, it's only when they were very small children and they couldn't really be controlled and so were running all over the place. But since they've become adults, they would know you don't go into the servants' areas. It is not the done thing. The other problem really comes down to the milk. There's no decent refrigeration until the 1880s. There's no pasteurisation until around about the same time, sort of 1870s. Louis Pasteur isn't even born until the late 1820s. So this is way before that. Milk would probably not come in a bottle because milk doesn't come in bottle, isn't delivered in bottles until the 1860s. Yeah. Milk is commonly delivered every morning by milkmaids who walk in from farms or dairies and basically distribute milk. I've got a couple of pictures here of dairy maids who would come into town with milk pails mounted on their shoulders. Yeah, that's how milk is delivered. There's even a scene in the film Oliver, which is set in 1820s, 1830s, where we have dancing milkmaids dressed exactly like this. So yeah, that's how milk is delivered. It's a fresh product that comes in fresh every day. By midnight on a May evening, which is when this is set, that milk might be on the turn. There's no decent refrigeration, but they probably would have kept the milk in a jug, covered up, in a pantry or in a store cupboard, possibly on a marble shelf, which would help keep it cool. It might also be kept in a cellar area, which again might be cool. But when we're talking cool here, we're talking cellar temperature, which is the same temperature that beer is stored at in Britain. So yeah, is that cold? Is that something you would ever describe as cold? I don't think so. Now, they did have ice. If you've seen the opening scenes of Frozen, you'll know about people cutting ice from lakes. And if you've read On Walden Pond, you'll also know that he describes the commercial cutting of ice. And this was happening at the time. Certainly a country house would skim the ice off lakes and store it in an ice house, but a townhouse might have to rely on some kind of ice merchant delivering them ice. It would be kept in a large trunk, but it probably wouldn't be used for cooling a product that you're going to usually use warmed up, or will be delivered fresh the next morning. So you're not probably not going to bother to keep it cold, but you will keep it cool, or at least the cellar temperature. Yeah, there is one possibility, however, of them having milk in a bottle, and that is preserved milk. I have a recipe that I found in a book published in 1826 called The Complete Servant. I'll be coming back to this book because it's a very good source book on servants, and this talks about preserved milk. If you look at the recipe, it looks like they are ultra heat treating milk, which makes it shelf stable, which makes it keep for quite a long time. You may have noticed ultra heat treated milk, which is terrifyingly not very close to refrigerators. It's on a shelf in the supermarket and you see it and you scream for your mother and that sort of thing. It's not something you want to drink, and it tastes a bit funny. We also have the problem of the range. They can't get it to operate. This is not surprising. It's not gas. It's not electric. Again, those are all late 19th century things, not early 19th century things. It's going to be wood-fired or coal-fired or coke-fired or charcoal-fired. Yes, it takes tens of minutes to heat it up, and you're not going to heat it up, if you think about it, for just a small amount of milk for a couple of posh people. What they probably would have used to warm the milk is a warming jug, which is essentially a little copper pot on the end of a long handle. You hold this over a fire, or by that metal bit which you often see near open fires, or you hold it over a candle or a lamp, and that will warm the milk up nicely for you. This is a spirit stove from the 18th century and would quite possibly have been used, and people may be familiar with this sort of thing from, say, a fondue set, where you need to keep the cheese nice and bubbling. Now, clearly, I'm making far too much of a fuss about this, but it's because it took me out of the story. I didn't think as much of Julia Quinn after the milk scene. I still enjoyed the book afterwards, but it took quite a while for me to get back out of my rabbit hole. Another major problem with the first two of Julia Quinn's books was the servants. Now, I knew that she'd found out about servants in her books because the versions of the Bridgerton stories I read had the second epilogues. When Julia Quinn wrote each of the books, she would put in an epilogue, usually set about a year after the marriage, sort of birth of the first child, that sort of thing. When she'd finished the 8 books, she then wrote a book called Bridgerton's Happily Ever After, which was a series of 8 second epilogues for each of the stories, and these are set 10 to 15 years after each of the original stories ended. And my edition had the second epilogues in them, so I knew that she knew all about servants. Now, I should point out, of course, there are plenty of servants mentioned in the first 2 Bridgerton books. The problem is there are also lots of scenes where you go, where are the servants? Shouldn't there be servants here? There's a particular kind of servant that she misses out, and these are what might be known as body servants. These are the ladies' maids and the valets. There are books, of course, about ladies' maids and valets. There's a book, an anonymous book called The Duties of the Lady's Maid, and of course there is the book The Complete Servant, published in 1826, written by Samuel and Sarah Adams, who were, I believe, a butler and a housekeeper, and they would have been working during the Regency. You might say, well, it is understandable. Julia Quinn is an American. She doesn't know anything about servants. There is no popular culture that features servants in any way, shape or form, apart from these 10. And another dozen that I could put up if I wanted to. She does ignore a particular kind of servant, which is very important during this time. And that is the personal servant, the body servant. If you remember the television series Veep, We have a character played by Tony Hale, who is the body man to Julia Louis-Dreyfus's vice president. And he is completely devoted to her, and he knows all her secrets. Because that's a point about valets and ladies' maids. They knew everything about their masters and mistresses. They knew what they looked like naked. They knew the stains on their undergarments. So there were very few, you could keep very few secrets from your lady's maid or valet. You'd have to trust them a lot, and you would often become friendly with them. A very good example of the friendship between a lady and her lady's maid is in Beaumarchais' play The Marriage of Figaro, turned into a fantastic opera by Mozart. And the relationship between Susanna, the maid, and the Countess is absolutely wonderful, and it's built on complete trust and love. Now, this relationship is very complex, and we see that in the humorous treatment of it 100 years after the Regency, when you get to the Jeeves and Wooster books by P.G. Wodehouse. That relationship, it's not quite being best friends, but it is somebody you can rely on totally, and from whom you have absolutely no secrets. And I think that's a very important thing to bear in mind when we come to this. Now, there are books that deal with the relationship between masters and servants. Obviously, I've already mentioned Pamela, but there is Joe Baker's book, Longbourn, which tells a story of the sort of below stairs, the servants at the Longbourn household, the house of the Bennet sisters. And it does seem to capture that those relationships between servant and master very accurately. It is interesting to note that Jane Austen doesn't really do servants, and this is possibly a reason why Julia Quinn didn't include a lot of servants in her book. After all, Jane Austen doesn't use them, so they're almost invisible. In fact, Jane Austen doesn't mention them an awful lot in her letters. They are kind of invisible to her. This is something that Faye Weldon mentions in her book Letters to Alice. The thing that Jane Austen does, though, is that any time a servant is needed, a servant appears. And this can be sometimes a bit jarring, especially in early written books like Northanger Abbey, which is the first complete book that she finished. They're not quite so much mentioned in Emma or Mansfield Park or Persuasion. But she also doesn't create, in those later books at least, doesn't create situations in which servants are necessary. The last and biggest problem that I have with Julia Quinn's Bridgerton books, and it is a problem I have with Julia Quinn's books, I don't expect you to have this problem, it's all my fault. Don't blame Julia Quinn, don't blame yourself. But the biggest problem I have is nomenclature. Now, it is apparently a known thing that Regency romance novelists sort of just grab the nearest sort of dictionary of children's names and just pick them out by a pin. It sometimes looks like that. They're very careless about how they're done. And the Regency romance author Cheryl Bolen who is an American, she was rather troubled by this because she doesn't like having that kind of reputation. So she did a bit of research and wrote a blog entry about it, and I'll include a link to the blog entry in the description. In this blog entry, she goes through some research that she's done. And essentially, during the Regency, there seems to have been two basic rules operating. One is it the name of Prince or Princess from England, Britain, or Scotland, or is it the mother's family name? Best known example of using a family name is, of course, Fitzwilliam Darcy, Mr. Darcy. Mrs. Darcy, née Fitzwilliam, is the daughter of an earl, and to honour the earl, Mr. Darcy is given the first name Fitzwilliam. The best known person with this kind of first name as a mother's maiden name is Spencer Perceval. Up to now, the only Prime Minister to have been assassinated, and he was assassinated in the Houses of Parliament in 1813. And Spencer Perceval, well, the Spencer is the Spencer family, which we know from Lady Diana. What Cheryl Bolen did in her research was she went to Burke's peerage. There are around 30 non-royal dukes in Regency Britain at the time, and when you add in the earls, the marquises, the viscounts, and the barons, who are just the lords, you've probably got only about 500 people. So you could theoretically find out the name of every single earl and duke alive at the time, and find out an awful lot about what their stories were, if you wanted to. And you can do this through things like Debrett or Burke's Peerage, which is what Cheryl Bolen did. Now, this means that when you compare this to Julia Quinn's names, they don't work very well. A lot of them are possible, but you'd have to write a really decent backstory. And the only name that has a really decent backstory is the last one, and that Hyacinth. But that's wrong for other reasons, as we'll find. So let's go through the names of the Bridgerton children alphabetically and see whether or not they work. And of course, it's purely my opinion, and like I said, if it doesn't take you out of the story, you do you. It's okay. We start with Anthony. Anthony is actually perfectly good. It's an okay name for as an aristocratic name. Arthur would probably be better. There are plenty of Princes Arthur. They're usually rather unfortunate. You don't want to have a prince named Arthur. It's rather unlucky in the royal family. I think the king's second name is Arthur. Another choice would be Alexander. But, like I say, Anthony is okay. The next one is Benedict. And this is the first time you get something that really doesn't quite work. Benedict is in his mid-20s in 1813, or early to mid-20s in 1813. It tells you that he is born in the late 1780s. Now ask yourself, especially if you're an American, who do you think the best-known Benedict was in the late 1780s? It's probably this guy, Benedict Arnold. You might say, well, that would be a very popular name in Britain, wouldn't it? Because he betrayed the Americans to the British. Yeah. And that might be true, except for this guy. This guy is Major John Andre. He was the spy master who recruited Benedict Arnold and helped him defect to the British lines. Unfortunately, John Andre was found himself behind the American lines, was caught, and was hanged. And while the Americans had every right to hang him if they wanted to, he was after all a spy, he would have been very useful for prisoner exchange. They could have got back some people, and there even was talk at the time of just handing Benedict Arnold straight back in exchange for John Andre, although that wasn't done. So this and other things about Benedict Arnold and the fact that he sort of was a double betrayer, betraying Britain, then betraying America, this made Benedict Arnold rather unpopular. So the name Benedict is actually a very, very bad choice for the B name. Decent ones would be something like Benjamin, maybe Bartholomew would be better. We then come to Colin. Colin. Okay, now we know why he's called Colin. He's called Colin because of this guy. Yeah, this is Colin Firth. He's the exception to the rule. What is the rule? Oh yeah, English Collins are disappointing. Almost always. You might struggle to find another English Colin who wasn't disappointing. Other Collins from other places are very exciting. This, for example, is the Irish Colin Farrell. Yeah, exciting, wonderful, Oscar nominated. This is the English Colin Farrell, also an actor, goes by the name Col Farrell because of the Irish guy. If you're expecting the Irish Colin Farrell, you would be a little bit disappointed by this guy. I mean, he's a very good actor, I should say, and go and watch his episode of Porridge, and he's really good in that. But you have to say you're going to be a little bit disappointed if you come across the English Colin Farrell, not the Irish Colin. Of course, the obvious alternative name would be Charles, like King's. I think there's a King Charles knocking around somewhere. We then move on to Daphne. Now, Daphne is again not really right for this period. It's a French name. Britain has been at war with France for best part of 20 years in 1813, and it's just unlikely to be popular. Of course, you have Daphne du Maurier, but she is late 19th, early 20th century rather than late 18th, early 19th century. So Daphne doesn't quite work. If you want a better name, Dorothea or Diana. In The Duke and I, Daphne is nicknamed Daff. If her name was Dorothea, she would be nicknamed Dot. Daff. Dot. Daff. Dot. Dot. Daff. Yeah, I shall be visited by two sets of police for that one. The dad joke police and the historical accuracy police. Samuel Morse did not invent Morse code until 1828 or 9. We move on to Eloise. Again, French name. Give me a reason why she's got a French name. Now, there are lots of French emigres coming into Britain, especially aristocratic ones, and it would be perfectly possible for there to be a connection between the Bridgerton family and a noble French woman called Eloise, and that's why they call her Eloise. But as far as I know, that isn't in any of the books. It'd be great if it was. This is a big problem I have with these names. Some of them are possible, and if they're possible, you have to explain them. You really have to lay the groundwork. You can't just throw them out there. So what do we use instead of Eloise? Well, they nickname her Elle, which means you probably don't want to call her Elizabeth. She tends to get nicknamed things like Lizzie, Bess, Bethy, Betty, Beth, Liz, etc. Lots and lots of nicknames. If you want to call her Elle, then the best name is Eleanor, as in Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood, the heroines of Sense and Sensibility. Eleanor, a name of a number of extremely cool English queens. We then get Francesca, and Francesca is 2 letters off being right. Francesca sounds Italian. Okay, do the Bridgertons have some kind of Italian connection? Was the old Viscount Bridgerton, was he a sort of ambassador of some description to some Italian court? But of course, I doubt it's mentioned in the book. Well, the best name would be Frances, as in Frances Price. The problem, of course, might be that they tend to get nicknamed Fanny, which is problematic from the front or the back, depending on whether or not you're American or British. Anyway, yes, it is a bit of a problematic name, but you could, of course, call her Fran. One of the things, thinking about this particular name, is one of the fans or Frans or Fannies that crops up in literature is Ebenezer Scrooge's sister. And if you kind of date when the Christmas Carol is set and how old Ebenezer Scrooge is and how old his sister would be, she'd be about the same age as Francesca, which is an interesting thought, same age as Francesca Bridgerton. Next we have Gregory. Why not George? I mean, there's been 3 kings called George. The Lightning Next king, the Prince of Wales, the Prince Regent, is also called George. He becomes George IV. Yeah, there are Georges all over the place. There are Georges all over Jane Austen. There are so many Georges. Everyone's called George. The author might have said, well, there are too many Georges. I don't want this many Georges. Then put that in the words of Violet Bridgerton, the mother. Put that in the words of the father. Don't just make an authorial decision and then not explain it. Explain your reasoning. But it doesn't happen. Just picks Gregory out of the air because she doesn't want to pick George, presumably. The last name is Hyacinth. Now, on the face of it, Hyacinth is actually a good name because it is explained. It's the favourite flower of her mother, Violet, and I believe when the old Viscount dies, he's actually picking hyacinths for his pregnant wife, and Hyacinth Bridgerton is born very soon after. The major problem with this is that flower names are just not in fashion at this time. Again, something that happens in the mid to late 19th century. That's when we start getting a large number of flower names cropping up. And it just doesn't work. So it's not only Hyacinth that's wrong, it's also Violet that's wrong. So what do we call her? Well, Henrietta, Harriet. There's several Harriets in Jane Austen books, and I think there's at least one Henrietta. So there you go. Like I said, these are my problems with the books. They don't have to be yours. Enjoy the books for what they are. Hopefully I won't put you off them. I do recommend them, and I'm going to read all 8 books